The unquestionable star of the video for this exercise is the dog. He has a bit of a epic fail around 310 climbing the riverbank. That's what he does. They call him the dog who likes to climb trees. He just loves to explore, climb on things. And we know this place very well, so he's absolutely fine running around and exploring. He's perfectly safe there. Loves swimming in the river. He's also here right now next to the microphone, so if you hear an odd sound, it's him. I was thinking anyway of Wang Xiangjai when he talks about how society represses our innate human potential and how, well, I was extrapolating from that the whole society seems to just give up on physical cultivation. I mean, you might have a brief period of youth where physicality is very important, but then it just seems to fade for a lot of people. And I'm not demeaning any kind of intellectual pursuit. Me of all people wouldn't do that because that's my job. But nevertheless, somehow that purpose, that existence in the world as a physical being just seems to be eroded away. People give up on it and bodies just go even further in that direction of losing touch with their physical potential. But the dog doesn't have a single thought in his head about anything that's ever happened to him, anything that might ever happen to him. He just absolutely enjoys being in that moment as a physical being, running, swimming, climbing, digging, biting, epic fail here or there, making a noise, just the sheer joy of being a physical being. And that's one of the reasons why I still really love Taolu. So I don't share this. I understand where Wang Xiangjai is coming from with regards to Taolu, i.e. forms, but I really like Taolu. I really like forms. I like being a physical being, exploring physical potential in a physical world. I think that's the idea of Wushu, ultimately. And it's interesting how, again, it's a symptom of the same thing, that people focus on this idea of spirituality, which again is very often just about putting it all back in your head. But Wushu as a physical pursuit, as the antidote to this repression of physical potential. Anyway, that was just a side thought that the dog made me think about. Today we're moving on to exercise 3 in our unfolding of understanding into, first of all, balanced whole body unified force. And something that you very often hear Yiquan people say is that there's much more going on in standing than you can tell just by looking at someone being still, which of course is absolutely true. And I think if people are standing for periods of 15, 20, 30 minutes, then you already know this. But our mission at the moment is to make this link between practical fight outcomes. So going along the chain from relaxation through whole body unified force, use of Fa Li, technical development, eventually into sparring, and seeing the links that link every element of the chain together. And our next link in that chain is to start thinking about using 2 vectors. And vectors is one of those words that, again, each one people use all the time, vectors and planes. And as I said before, sometimes people use the same word to describe different things, all of which are completely legitimate. So having a clear shared vocabulary where we all understand that we're talking about the same thing with particular words is very important for the future of each one as a social project. So when we say vector, what we mean is something very similar or a version of this idea of movement within stillness. So it's the feeling that you're pushing in a particular direction without actually moving. And Wang Xiangjai didn't learn like this, so this is part of the problem with Wang Xiangjai's transmission of knowledge to his students, which all of his students recognised was a problem, and Wang Xiangjai himself recognised was a problem because he didn't like how his students were taking his teaching and formalising it into the practice of different kinds of vectors separately. And what I mean by that is that when Wang Xiangjai was learning, he felt the experience that I've talked about before, that is sometimes called radiating or radiating light. It's a metaphor, of course, but a feeling that you are pushing in all directions simultaneously. And we should also note that we mean a very particular kind of feeling when we say pushing, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So this feeling of radiating doesn't contradict any laws of physics or any laws of physiology. If you trigger, let's say it's as simple as this for the moment, but if you trigger the nerves that would cause you to initiate a movement, say you're in the holding the ball posture and you trigger the movement to initiate squeezing, and at the same time you trigger the movement to initiate pushing out, can you hold those two feelings simultaneously? Yes, you can. If you're completely still, then all you're doing is triggering the nerve, so it doesn't contradict any logical understanding of physiology. You can pull in and push out at the same time if your actual physical posture is in stillness, because you're just triggering the nerves that would initiate that movement. Most people eventually get to feel that if you go deep enough into your standing and you follow the right method, which isn't a particularly difficult or complex method, as I'll talk about in a moment. That feeling is the most fundamental, elemental expression of whole body unified force. And Wang Xiangjia himself explains this, that you experience that, and then to make it practical for martial arts, you have to skew it. You have to skew the posture. That's exactly what we're doing in learning balanced whole body unified force, and then we're going to skew it into unbalanced whole body unified force. It's exactly the same method as used by Wang Xiangjia. The problem is that Wang Xiangjia got this straight away, whereas most people don't, and certainly his students didn't. And Yao Zongzun talks about him being very grumpy with his students because he couldn't understand why they couldn't get it. And also, most of his students also talk about the fact that Wang Xiangjia wasn't a great teacher. He couldn't think of a pedagogy, a way of teaching it to other people that would make it easier for them to get it step by step. He just expected them to be able to do it the way that he could do it, so he wasn't aware that he was a one-off. Or, I don't know, because I have not been inside his head, but maybe he was aware, but he just couldn't conceptualize it, couldn't understand it. I think a little bit like my father, who was a brilliant artist and sculptor, and he always used to say that he could teach people to paint, teach people to draw. It's easy, you've just got to look at, and I used to say, there's no chance. If you haven't got that thing, you haven't got it. And he couldn't conceptualize that, so maybe it was a little bit similar to that for Wang Xiangjia. In any case, Yao Zongzun talks about having to think about a different method, and all of Wang Xiangjia's students, as far as I'm aware, come up with the same solution, and that is to work on individual vectors and then build up into 2 vectors, 3 vectors, 4 vectors, so on, until you finally get the feeling. The question then is, what do we mean by vector? In the previous exercise, we did a visualization where we imagined a boulder resting against the palms of our hands and pushing into us. So we weren't pushing into it, we were just feeling the weight of the boulder. Nevertheless, the feeling that we're developing in that exercise is like we're pushing out, pushing forward. And that's the first basic element of what we mean by a vector. Pushing or pulling, or it could be twisting or turning or bending, and the feeling of that. The next thing to think about is the quality of the movement itself. So imagine putting your hands on the wall and pushing. You're not pushing the wall anywhere, you're not pushing yourself backwards, but nevertheless all the muscles are engaged and you have that feeling that you're pushing even though you're going nowhere. That's one very important sense of movement within stillness. So there's that sense that the potential movement is there. It's kind of frozen in a moment as you're pushing against the wall. And that gives us an intellectual understanding of how you might have something like movement within stillness, but it doesn't tell us what the actual feeling is like, because the feeling that we're after is not that feeling. So imagine, for example, that you're just doing the exercise that we did last week where we're imagining pushing against a boulder. And our instructions were to use mental induction to try and trigger the feeling that there is something physically there. How do you do that? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing that, and you'll have heard people talk about the idea of not using clumsy force, or indeed not using force at all. And what we mean by that is that it's quite easy to fake the sense that there's something there just by tensing up. And that's not the feeling that we want. So you imagine that there's a boulder there, and then you just tense up your arms and your shoulders and your legs a little bit, and then imagine that you're pushing against something. That's really easy to do. Anyone can do that. You don't need to do standing to get that feeling. And there's another element of this that makes it clear that this isn't the right feeling that we're after. So if you use a little micro movement, so if you just push backwards and forwards a little bit when you're using what we call clumsy force, which is just really a complex way of saying tense. If you just tense up and push backwards and forwards, say an inch using micro movement, there will be no difference in the quality of feeling in any part of that movement. And everyone's experienced this who practices Yiquan and continues to experience it, because it comes back again into your movement. And this is what you've got to check for when the old Yiquan masters say, check your posture, check that you're not bringing clumsy force back into it. You're just tensing up and you're getting this feeling, and okay, that's not the right feeling. Then you've got to relax again. The feeling that we're after is qualitatively different, and it doesn't begin with tension. So you will have heard people say, I've said it myself, it's a key idea in Yiquan that the more you relax, the more intense the feeling is. And that's quite abstract, but we can say much less abstract is understanding that when we get the right feeling, the micro movement feels completely different, and it feels completely different in different parts. So the feeling is like you can move just a little bit. So you push and there's no resistance, and then when you've pushed about, let's say, well, it could be a tiny amount actually, it could be like a quarter of an inch or something like that, you feel resistance, like something is there and it stops you, and then you pull back and it's relaxed for a quarter of an inch. Relaxed isn't the right word, but you can rock between these two extremes of tension. So you push your hands forwards and backwards, and you feel those two extremes, one forward, one back, and in the middle is that quarter of an inch where you can rock, like a quarter of an inch of leeway, of give. So there's a different feeling in different parts of the micro movement. I've said before a few times, it's like you're inside a plaster cast, a whole body plaster cast. You can move a little bit, but then you reach the limitations of the plaster cast. So the whole movement isn't the same. That's very different to when you just tense. When you just tense, the whole movement is the same. And then you get into a bit of a cat and mouse with it, because you find yourself tensing up again and you've got to relax again to get the feeling more strongly and so on, but we'll look at that another time. Now, when we do a movement like that, when we do a micro movement, we're using two vectors. So one is forward and one is backwards. So we're pushing forward and pushing backwards, and we're rocking between the two, and it's like you're rocking between them in a micro movement. But that's not the same thing as experiencing two vectors simultaneously. That's just going from one vector forward to another vector backwards, then vice versa rapidly. But what we're after first is holding the vector in one direction. So using that intellectual understanding of pushing against a wall. So we're not using micro movement when we do that. We're pushing and we've kind of frozen movement within stillness, but the quality of the movement itself is the same as when we using micro movement in the way that we've just described. So it's not tension, it's not just bringing tension into our body. This, by the way, is why we use mental induction. It's the primary reason why we use mental induction visualization, because if you just try and do it, you just tense. You start off from a position of tension and you just become even more tense. When we use mental induction, we go first of all right down to the deepest level of relaxation that we possibly can. And remember, it's not just about relaxation, it's about combining relaxation and tension. But for our first stage, we go down to the finest level of relaxation that we can get. And then we have to play this kind of trick on our programming. Instead of bringing tension into our limb, we bring a visualization into our mind. And we let that just reprogram the feeling. We let it build it up from the absolute minimal possible level into creating the feeling. And the idea is we won't just start tensing up then and getting the clumsy force feeling. We'll get the right kind of feeling. I'll come back to that another time. For now, what we need to understand is that we're going to experience that vector not as a micro movement, but just pushing in a particular direction and holding that feeling. A moment of movement that's frozen in stillness, but doesn't have the quality of clumsy force. It has this very specific quality of relaxed feeling. And then, as the ancients used to say, that the Tao emerges from emptiness. It's that feeling that solidity emerges from emptiness. And that's when you get in that cat and mouse game where you feel yourself tensing up with it, and then you've got to relax again. And the more you relax, the stronger the feeling gets. And that will be pushing in one direction, so using one vector. And from there, our next step is to keep pushing in that direction, but experience pushing simultaneously in another direction. So 2 vectors, and that's the exercise that we're going to use today. I'll describe the posture first so that we understand it, and there's a few things around this and a few things around the visualization that are hopefully going to be quite interesting and useful to explore. So the posture is a little bit like bear holding a stone, but if you imagine turning your hands round the other way so that your palms are facing downwards, it's not quite the same. It's higher than that, so you're holding your hands higher than that, and you're holding them further out, which is a feature of the fact that you've twisted your arms out, and that makes a massive difference. So this posture is actually quite difficult to do. When we turn the palms down, we're twisting the limb, and what we're doing there is we're bringing torque, 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 into the posture, and that puts a different strain on the arm. So it's a much more difficult posture than bear holding a stone that doesn't have that torque in it. We twist the hands forward so that the palms are facing downwards, and you'll feel straight away like a spiral of tension in the arms. That's the torque in the arms, and also it affects the upper arms. It makes you pull the posture out a little bit forward, so the tops of your arms will virtually be in the same position as when you do the basic ball holding posture, and all you'll do is just drop your hands, what we call hourglassing. So the elbows stay in the same position and you drop the hands forwards and down. And what this is screwing force. It's screwing force frozen in a moment. So if you imagine elbowing out to the side using this posture, there's different ways of doing it, but the way to do it with screwing force would be to twist your palm downwards, release force out with the elbow to the side. And if you imagine freezing that at pretty much the last moment, that's a moment, the last moment of screwing force, and then you just capture that and hold it in this posture. And that also is a vector, but we're not going to consider that too much today. But we can mention that last week we did a posture where our hands were quite far apart and our fingers were pointing straight up, and we can compare and contrast that with the more usual standing posture where your hands are closer together and usually the fingers are pointing towards one another. So it follows the natural physiology of an average person. It feels much more comfortable to do that, and that's also adding screwing force in when you do that in the second way with your fingers pointing towards. It's the initiation of screwing force. So if you were going to change that into a punch, for example, you'd screw it a little bit more, but we flattened it out, and that gives a completely different sense of tension in the body. This time we're doing the opposite. We're bringing the screwing force right up to the last moment. So when our hands are down like that, if we were going to elbow out, that's exactly where our hands would be. And we've captured and frozen that moment of screwing force in a zhuang. And that's why we do the posture in this way, because it's a really great sense, a feeling of the arms moving dramatically out to the side that's been frozen in a moment, and that feeds into the first visualization that we want, and that is feeling or imagining, visualizing that there's a rope tying our hands together. So a rope tied round our wrists, a very short rope, and in that position, in this zhuang, we feel like, not that we're pulling against that rope, we just want to feel the tension that it's there, almost like, our hands have been tied up, not quite handcuffs, but with a rope, and they've been bound like that, and we just feel the tension of them. So we're pushing out either side, and that's one vector. Or we should say more accurately, one vector per arm, but each arm's doing the same thing. So pushing out to the side. And here you can see the problem with the idea of clumsy force. If you start deliberately trying to push out and then create a sense of resistance, that's when you start tensing to kind of fake the feeling. But if we use mental induction, if we just, from the absolute granular level, just start to imagine, visualize that rope is there and just start to feel it, so that we don't bring in any unnecessary tension whatsoever until we feel that vector and we feel like the movement is just frozen in stillness. That's the feeling that we want. How soon you go for that feeling is up to you. I like to relax in the posture for about 10 minutes before I start working with any kind of visualization, or I'll work with visualizations that encourage relaxation, like, for example, being under a warm shower or having warm water poured onto you, which is one of the visualizations that Wang Xiangjia used to use. After about 10 minutes, then I like to start working on the first step of the mental induction. There's no fixed methods. It's taken as a given at the moment that our average is going to be around half an hour for doing these exercises. I do this one, I didn't time it at the time, but I did just over 40 minutes, which felt just right for me, because this feeling with the torque in the arms, that's quite an intense zhuang. Don't underestimate it. It's absolutely not like something like bear holding a stone. It's quite an intense feeling. So that was okay for me, but anything around about half an hour gives you enough time to play with the different mental inductions. And once you get this feeling, this sense that rope is there, and you play a little bit, feeling, is that clumsy force? Do I need to relax? Do I need to get the right kind of feeling back? Play with that for about 10 minutes. And then the second aspect of the mental induction is to then imagine that there's another rope, and this rope is tied to the middle of the rope that's holding your hands together, and that rope is then tied down to your feet. So think about those, those shackles that you sometimes see prisoners wear, where their hands are shackled together and then there's another chain going down to their feet. So we don't want the image of chains because it creates a heavier sense, and mental induction can be that fine-grained. We want to think about the feeling rather than the weight. So we imagine a rope, so a rope tying our hands together, and then the next rope is from the middle of that rope down to our feet. And we want it to our feet really rather than the floor, because that helps to induce a sense of connecting the legs into the overall posture. And we're going to feel like we're going to continue this vector of feeling that the rope is there. We're not pulling against it as such, but we're holding it with some tension. And then just from the arms first, this is important, just from the arms first, imagine just pulling up against the rope that's going down to your feet. And that's very tense as well. So, or the rope, imagine the rope's got a lot of tension in it. So now you're trying to create this feeling that you've got two vectors, one pulling out to the sides and one pulling up. So you're experiencing two vectors simultaneously. Now, there isn't that much to it other than that at this stage, but remember that we're trying to maintain balanced whole body unified force. There's no point jumping ahead. There's no point at this stage bringing in micro movements, which we could make this posture much more complex. We could make this mental induction much more active, but experience how difficult it is to maintain complete balance over two vectors, just two vectors, equal force pulling out to the sides, and absolute equal force on either side and in either leg pulling up. Just maintaining across those two vectors a complete sense of balance, and just trying to maintain that sense of balance brings tension and clumsy force into your posture, and it also can make you just stumble, and not stumble, but it can make you spasm in the posture and a range of other things. It's actually very difficult to do. So it's incredibly good foundation training. Not just incredibly good, it's absolutely essential foundation training that you start to work on this and get it smooth, get it down pat before you start skewing the posture, which is what we're going to work on a few videos from now. For now, we really need to spend time making sure that we get this balanced sense of whole body unified force. When you've worked on that, when you've used mental induction to visualize these two vectors, and remember, focusing on keeping the feeling in the arms and maybe a little bit in the legs, then maybe about 20-25 minutes in, do something different. And I'm saying 25 minutes in because it takes this amount of time for the whole structure to relax and just to start to knit together in the right way. After about that period of time, you can do something else which is a little bit more interesting. You can just change so that you are pulling back with your back. So you want to feel the same sense of resistance in your arms, the same vector in your arms all the way down your back. So now you're feeling like you're pulling up, so that vector of pulling up against the rope that goes down to your feet, that you're bringing in more of your whole structure, in fact your whole structure, to pull up against that rope. And try and feel the difference between just doing it with your arms and just doing it with your back. And the more that's involved, the more of your body that's involved, the harder it is for the intent to not slip into clumsy force. So you can play with that a little bit. It's a much more advanced mental induction, but it's incredibly useful. Remember though, technically that isn't quite keeping it balanced. So if we move around either of our key axes, the quad axis or the spine axis, that's technically skewing the posture. But just try and keep the feeling completely balanced either side, left and right, as you push back with your back. And remember, when we say push back, we don't mean just faking it by actually tensing or consciously pushing back. You've got to visualize using your back to pull against that rope. That's what creates that granular level that keeps that correct feeling like there is movement. Like if you were to do it as a micro movement, there would be give there. It wouldn't just be the same feeling of tension. That's the difficult thing to get. There is one more thing you can do here if you want to do something much more advanced and you're much more interested in the fight side of things. Because at this point, by the way, this is the foundation for the fight training, but it's also what we call the health side of mental induction, the health side of using standing. The health side of standing primarily uses balanced whole body unified force. But if you're much more interested in progressing into that fight side of things, there's another visualization that you can use here. Most Chinese martial arts fans will have seen a movie where the villain is shackled in one of those, those great big things that they used to put criminals in China in the past, a big board around your head, or their wrists are tied up, and at any moment they're just going to release force and break those shackles and start fighting. Well, you can start to try and induce that feeling, that sense that you're going to shatter those, you're going to break that rope, and when you break that rope, you're going to start fighting. So you can work on that feeling yourself, whatever works for you, but it's a feeling a little bit like, you have to develop this anyway, and Wang Xingjai talks about developing this kind of attitude, this kind of wrath, so that when you have to actually fight, you can slip into this mindset and you can work on it in sparring. We'll talk about that another time. But a feeling like the moment these ropes break, you're immediately going to start fighting, and you can get a very strong feeling all over your body. You can start getting the hair standing up on, the goose pimples, hair standing up on end feeling if you get deep into that feeling. And that's it. That's all we need to do for this week, working on those say this week, you might want to spend months on it, working on getting 2 vectors. Don't rush ahead. If you can't get the feeling across 2 vectors, you've got to spend time working on it, because we only need to move on working with more vectors at the same time. So there's no shortcuts. This is the shortcut. Enjoy standing.